Hello everyone, it's Liz Bennett here, Head of Consultancy for the IMechE, for the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, and a very warm welcome to this, our latest webinar on risk and safety management training. Those of you who regularly join in our webinars know that this is one of the series of webinars that we run regularly. But if you are new to us, then please do feel free to access all of our other webinars through our IMechE website. They're all of subjects that are of interest and great relevance to the engineering community, so feel free, they are free. It's my pleasure today to host this webinar and to introduce to you Andy Smith. And Andy is our subject matter expert and our preferred partner in the provision of risk and safety management. And he has earned his credentials well and truly, because Andy, and he'll introduce himself to you in a moment, but Andy has been working in the industry since 1997 across a number of sectors, including oil, gas and nuclear. As far as training is concerned, Andy himself has spent, the last 7-8 years designing and delivering training, both face-to-face and distance learning, and is today speaking to you from East Kilbride near Glasgow. So, in a moment I will hand over to Andy, and then Andy will take you through the rest of his presentation and then pass back to me at the end. So, thank you very much. Andy, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Liz. It's a pleasure to be talking to everyone today on this subject, which is one that's quite close to my heart, really, and how we can try and get the most out of the training that we both go on and specify and develop for others to participate in. So what we're going to look at fairly quickly is we're going to review some of the causes of major accidents. We'll look at how effective training can help in some of those specific incidents, and see how things like game-based learning and other techniques can help us get the most out of our training, both in terms of retention, but also in terms of just the experience that people have when they're on those training courses. So the first thing we will look at is some incidents. Now, some of these are from a reasonable time in the past, but there's still some good lessons to be learned from them. Each one split down into 4 main areas. We look at the incident itself and some of the consequences that arose from that incident. We then will look at some of the immediate causes that were identified, and then we go on to looking at the root causes, so how those immediate causes came about, mainly because those root causes are the things that we're seeking to try and address through our improved training. And then we will briefly look at some of the longer term industry impact that some of those incidents had, because they were quite wide-reaching in the majority of cases, and some of them resulted in some fairly fundamental changes to the approaches used, both in terms of daily operations, but also risk management and, in some instances, training and awareness as well. So if we move along to the first one we've got is the 3 Mile Island. Apologies for these slides, have been a little bit busy. But 3 Mile Island was a nuclear power generation station which underwent a partial core meltdown back in the late 70s. There were no fatalities, but there was a voluntary evacuation of 140,000 people, which is obviously quite a significant incident. The immediate causes were some failures of equipment, but part of the problem was that the indicated plant status to the operators wasn't actually a true reflection of what was happening on the plant, and as a result the responses that those operators took was incorrect, and the problem developed from there. The inquiry effectively found that there were some improvements needed to operator training and to the emergency planning and the dissemination of information to the operators and to the safety analysis itself as well. Ultimately, this was one of the first melted fuel incidents in a full-scale plant, and according to the Atomic Energy Authority, it was a massive turning point in terms of our understanding and the development of nuclear power, both in the States but internationally as well, really. So quite a significant incident, and we can already see from this that there's some issues there that training, practice and so on can potentially have improved things. The next incident is King's Cross, so this was kind of late 80s. A major escalator fire which ultimately progressed to engulfing quite a large part of the station and the ticket halls, led directly to 31 fatalities. The proposed cause was that it was started by either a burning match or a discarded cigarette, leading to ignition of materials in an escalator machine room. You've got to remember in these days the escalators were largely wooden stairs, so there was plenty of fuel to go on fire. What came out following the report was that there had been a number of near misses prior to this incident. The incident itself, there was actually quite a significant delay from detection initially of somebody saying, I think I can see flames through the steps of this escalator, to any action being taken. There was generally a poor perception of the risk associated with this, and there was a lack of competency with respect to particularly the management of emergency response and overall just the safety management and safety culture within that organisation was pretty poor at the time. The subsequent inquiry effectively led to a significant change in the fire safety regulations involving things like mandatory fire detection and suppression in certain areas, and very stringent controls on the management of flammable materials in subsurface stations. So quite wide-reaching ramifications from that incident. Again, we see some similar themes in those root causes. Next we've got the Clapham Junction rail crash. The Clapham Junction, one of the busiest rail interchanges in the UK at the time. 2 collisions involving 3 commuter trains, 35 fatalities and 500 injuries, so a significant rail incident. It was down to a signalling failure because of an error made by a technician during isolation of those signalling systems. The investigation dug down a little deeper and found out that there were some fairly degraded working practices. There was problems around the adequacy of training, how the systems for testing and commissioning and so on were lacking or deficient in some ways. There wasn't particularly great supervision, and there had been some past incidents where lessons had not been learned and cascaded through into new working practices. There was also an issue around kind of excessive working hours as well, which all plays a factor in people making errors in judgment and so on. This was also the first one that really had a large realisation that at senior management level that there was a big issue with recognising that this project was actually a major and safety critical activity and not just a relatively trivial one. So there were some specific recommendations there about restricting working hours, particularly for safety critical staff, and ensuring that testing, commissioning procedures and so on were appropriate. Next one's probably quite familiar to most people really, the Piper Alpha explosion again in 1988. 167 out of the 226 rig crew were killed. It was a catastrophic event. An initial explosion ultimately spread to a much larger event, causing failure of the risers, and it burned for quite some time. The investigation there identified that the permit to work system was inadequate and had been bypassed in some instances, and that the shift handover process was quite poor as well, so problems with one shift weren't necessarily being communicated to the next shift. The fire water system had been rendered not operational, and ultimately the safety and evacuation training was inadequate. There was also some issues around delayed management decisions during the event as well, which obviously worsened the situation and allowed it to progress further. The Cullen inquiry made 106 recommendations. It was an extensive investigation report, and ultimately resulted in the introduction of the safety case process within the offshore industry. So a major change to the regulatory environment for the offshore industry at that point, with the duty being on that demonstration of safety and a kind of goal-based approach. Then we have Bayer Cropscience, which is maybe a bit less familiar to some of you. There was a major explosion, 2 fatalities and 8 people injured. The interesting thing here was there was a runaway chemical reaction which resulted in a pressure vessel failing, and part of that pressure vessel impacted with an adjacent pesticide manufacturing unit. Had it gone in a slightly different direction, it could have damaged a highly toxic methyl isocyanate tank, which would have had much more significant results potentially. It was a massive fireball and it burned for 4 hours. The issue there when the investigation was undertaken was that there had been some premature start-up of the plant with a number of deficiencies in place, and most of that was undertaken due to a pressure to resume production. There was a critical interlock overridden, and ultimately there were some fairly complex procedures with inadequate training and process hazard analysis supporting that. There was also no information to emergency responders to allow them to take the appropriate action. Ultimately, Bayer were fined a significant sum of money, and ultimately they cut the inventory down to 0 completely in 2011. So in this instance, it's a good example of a fairly complex situation, which, although some of the safety analysis had been undertaken, that just wasn't cascaded through into the daily practices on site. Now, in terms of what caused some of these accidents to happen, some of you may have seen this before. It's the kind of quite popular Swiss cheese model. Quite often we'll focus on the immediate causes, and safety management focuses on the immediate causes. But that's not a particularly fair representation of what's happened. We have a number of barriers or layers of protection or slices of cheese in this case. None of them are perfect. They all have deficiencies associated with them. And in a major accident, what we tend to find is that those holes, those inefficiencies have all lined up, have all come together to give us our major accident. And really we need to be looking at all of those barriers and all of the potential causes to establish why those events have occurred. A reactive culture takes us from the immediate causes and looks at trying to improve where those holes have occurred and try and fill the gaps and stop them happening again, whereas a proactive culture seeks to start from the top and actually look at keeping our processes and procedures and practices robust all the way through. Now, quite often our focus might be on that specific immediate cause, whether that's an equipment failure or an operator error or whatever, but in reality the human impact is spread across all of these barriers and can play a significant role in all of them functioning correctly. Even if they appear to be completely equipment-based, a piece of equipment is only as good as its maintenance regime or its testing practices or its design in the first place. So, not losing sight of the fact that the human has a significant contribution to play in faults we can move forward and start looking at how we can improve that. So there's a couple of quotes here, basically illustrating the significant contribution of the human in the incidents that we see. So, we're talking about 90% of all workplace accidents have some human error as a cause. It does make a significant contribution, and that's not just in terms of the initiating event, the thing that causes the hazard, but also in terms of how people respond to that incident, whether it's about recovering from a potentially dangerous situation, or whether it's about taking emergency response action. So it covers all the range of activities and also all the range of roles, right from your workspace operator right through to senior management, and the attitudes and the principles that they convey and try to pass down to others in the organisation. So we need to establish why those errors are occurring so that we can try and reduce the likelihood and impact of human error. And then we can look at how we can start to improve things. So specifically in terms of training, how can good training help us prevent or reduce the impact of these events? And there's a number of ways that we can do this. One is through increased awareness. And this sounds really obvious, but people don't deliberately go out to cause plant faults or accidents in general. Quite often we find that there's maybe a lack of appreciation for the potential impact of an action. There's maybe a disconnect between the activity that someone's performing and what role they might be playing in managing and preventing major accidents. So relatively simple awareness activities, just to reinforce the link between the activities a group of people are undertaking and maybe the major accident practices on the site, can reinforce that link and help them to actually comply with procedures and processes a bit more intelligently and a bit more knowledgeably, and minimise some of those errors that could occur. In terms of competency, technical training obviously can improve those things, and we're talking about there perhaps hazard identification and risk assessment, or how individual parts of somebody's job might be undertaken. Training is also good for reinforcing and refreshing good practice and drilling things like emergency response procedures, because those are the sorts of things that are as much cultural and habit forming as anything else. So having good processes in place to keep those things fresh and to keep them current as well, recognising that situations change, is critical. So training plays quite a major role in both the prevention and the reduction of potential impact in incidents. If we start looking at these in a bit of detail, there's the adage that if you haven't identified a hazard, then you aren't managing that hazard and you're not controlling it. So having very robust hazard identification processes is fundamental to your subsequent risk assessment and system design, operation, maintenance and so on being effective. So technical training in hazard identification helps ensure that we apply the right tools at the right time in the right way to give us the best chance of identifying all the significant hazards associated with our activities. It's also important that that training recognises the limitations of techniques, because that ensures that we recognise where there might be gaps or where there might be pitfalls with a certain technique in a certain situation, so that we can then look at complementary techniques that might fill those gaps. And as we saw when we looked at the King's Cross incident, one of the issues there was poor safety management and poor perception of the risk or the hazard that was actually present. The life cycle point there is also very critical, because ensuring that your hazard identification stays live is a fundamental part of this process. So learning from lessons, learning from the feedback you're getting from the site, learning from other parts of industry as well about the types of incidents that they are having, can also help keep your hazard identification live. Another aspect of technical training might be in risk analysis itself. And there's a similar series of concepts here, which is ensuring that you're using the right tools at the right time, getting the correct information that you need, but really emphasising this concept of risk and qualitative risk assessment techniques in particular, mainly because it's easy sometimes for us as engineers and the scientists in some instances to really get fixated on the numbers and the detail of quantified risk assessments. But it's really important to have that supported with a qualitative deterministic assessment that looks at your faults and says, does this seem reasonable? Does our protection that we have available seem appropriate? And are we rolling out to our workforce and the people that work on our sites the right information they need to ensure that our risk assessments are valid and that our processes continue to be managed safely? Training also allows you to help people become better at critically reviewing activities and risk assessments. So if they're maybe being done outside the organisation, they can review them as an intelligent customer and be a bit more critical of them and recognise the limitations and so on. Again, 3 Mile Island and the Bayer incident there were examples where poor safety analysis had led to incomplete management of some of the hazards there, or a perception of risk that wasn't accurate. So your training can help that significantly. ALARP is one of the key concepts, certainly within the UK regulatory framework, where the duty is always to reduce the risk to as low as reasonably practicable. I'm not sure how familiar you all are with the carrot diagram, the triangle diagram on the right-hand side there, where we have an unacceptable region where realistically risks cannot be permitted and they must be reduced. We have a broadly acceptable region at the bottom where, again, we're generally prepared to accept those risks at that level. But in the middle, we've got this region where it's tolerable if we can demonstrate that it's as low as reasonably practicable. Specific training around risk reduction in ALARP can help with conveying the concept of ALARP primarily, but also then show people how they can achieve ALARP as a deliverable, as an outcome from their assessments. So recognise that risk reduction measures aren't all equal. There is a hierarchy. Those that eliminate the hazard should be pursued first, rather than looking at procedures or PPE to try and manage it that way. So recognising the hierarchy, generating options for how that risk can be managed, and then making the appropriate choices from those options and documenting that so that there's a very clear, traceable and robust demonstration that you've understood how your plant operates. You've done what you can to reduce the risk, and here is the basis for the decisions that you've made on the risk reduction options that you've taken. ALARP's often a kind of bolt-on to a risk assessment, but really it's the crux of our safety cases, our safety analyses, because it's the part where we say we have done enough and this is why we think we have done enough. But again, that assessment needs to be constantly revisited because technology changes, the costs and the effectiveness of technology changes, and because of that our ALARP position is subject to change. So technical training there can really help with people in safety-related roles understanding that concept quite thoroughly and ensuring that it's applied correctly to their projects and their work. An increasingly popular technique and approach is one of Bowtie risk management. Bowties are nice graphical diagrams, roughly following that concept illustrated on the slide there, where we have a business upset, some kind of loss of control type event in the middle of our bow tie, and we have the causes out on the left and the potential impacts or consequences on the right. And in between those in the central node, we have the preventative or mitigating or recovery controls in place. So it provides quite a nice snapshot of how your hazards are caused, prevented, mitigated and how they could ultimately develop. They also allow you to identify the key activities and equipment items that are providing your risk reduction against your faults. So you get quite a nice snapshot of how your safety and risk management strategy is structured. Training in that Bowtie risk management can give you the ability to understand the methodology, obviously, and provide hands-on experience with the technique, letting you get the most out of it, because it's a relatively simple technique to employ, but there's quite a lot of information you can get from it, and it's extremely good as a kind of familiarisation tool for new starts or people to get up to speed with a new process or something like that. Now, technical training is one aspect of it. Regardless of what your training is actually covering, how can we ensure we get the most out of that training? What can we do to ensure that people retain the information they're getting on their training courses and that they then put it into practice in their workplace? The first thing there is this targeted use of training and education. There has to be a genuine need for the training. There's no point just sending somebody on a course because you've got a bit of budget free that year and there seems to be a course on topic X that would be suitable. There has to be a need, ideally quite an immediate need for it to be relevant to the individual. It needs to be the right person that's going on the training, so the person that's going to be either undertaking those types of activity or communicating them to the wider organisation. And as I say, this issue of timeliness is quite important. There's no point doing a course today for something that somebody might use next year. What you want to do is it to be relatively immediate so that they can start putting it into practice quickly so that they don't have the opportunity to lose some of that knowledge. The next three things on the slide are, once you have identified the need, these three things are ways that you can ensure that the benefits of that training continue to be maximised. So accelerated learning is all about ensuring we get the message through to people, as is game-based learning in a slightly different way, and we're going to look at these in a little bit more detail later. Embedding training in the organisation is the key element there of, you've been on the course, you've got the information, it's been a great course, but what do you do next? How do you ensure that that person comes back and are empowered to start putting that into practice in the workplace, and everyone getting the benefits from the training they've been on? So to make training effective, what we're really looking for is a good balance between the theory, the kind of lecture side of things and the information transfer, but also practical activities, getting a chance to practice things, because that engagement and the participation ensures that people actually get that knowledge embedded. Otherwise there can be a bit of a disconnect between, okay, I've been given this information, but what does that actually mean when I come to do that activity? It's also really critical to ensure that individual attendees on the course, that their objectives are actually met. With any training package, there will be a set of learning objectives. Now, some of these are going to be of more or lesser relevance to some of the attendees. Some attendees will come with a slightly different set of objectives. So trying to draw that information out of the delegates initially, see what they're interested in, see what they're less interested in, and then try and tailor the content as you go through to focus on some of their real problems, rather than it being just a direct, here is a generic training course, and you can pick out the bits that are useful to you. Time to reflect is quite a critical element. If you rattle through a training course with no breaks, no time for people to sit and process the information they've just been given and come back with questions, ultimately those questions pop out 2 or 3 days later, or when they actually start to do the activity in the workplace. And that can be too late sometimes. So ensuring you've built in some time to reflect, whether it's through structured activities where you're getting people to talk about what they've just learned, or whether you're just giving them a coffee break or a little bit of thinking space. That time to reflect can be extremely valuable in letting them come up with more informed questions and better challenges for the material that they've just seen. Using a range of media and styles also really helps break up the monotony of potentially a long course, but also caters for the different ways that people learn. So rather than just being 100% slides, we might have computer-based training packages, we might have quizzes, there might be stories and anecdotes, having some solo activities, syndicate exercises, debates. All of these things we can use to make the session a bit more interesting, a bit more engaging, but also, as I say, target the different ways in which people learn. Because everyone's different. Some of us like to read information, have some time to digest it, and then come back with questions. Others like to get straight into using it in practice and having a go and then coming up with questions based on their experience. So whenever you're looking at commissioning some training or sending people on training, or if you're developing it yourself, you need to make sure that you're trying to introduce a balance of these factors and making it appropriate to the material. So some material suits some of these methods better than others, and recognising that limitations helps. But wherever possible, try and have that balance. And we can see there that Clapham Junction and Piper Alpha both recognised that there was a problem with the way the training had been undertaken, and perhaps that was too much down the slides, the lecturing, the reading of information, rather than something a bit more interactive and experience-based. I mentioned accelerated learning earlier, and it's just an extension of what we've talked about in the previous slide, really, that people tend to learn more effectively when both their mind and body are involved in a learning experience, so they're physically doing things as well as just sitting and receiving information. We tend to prefer to actively create knowledge rather than just passively store information that's being broadcast to us. Collaborative learning is a key part of that. Getting people working together in groups, getting them to challenge each other is a great way to embed that understanding and check that people have understood concepts correctly. And certainly having that activity-centred approach to our training sessions is ideal. Again, we reinforced there that appealing to different learning styles is quite a critical thing. We might have 10, 15, 20 people in a training event, all of whom are going to prefer to learn in different ways. If we only cater for one of those 4 ways that we've got on that slide there, we're going to lose some of the people, or we're not going to communicate to them in an effective way. So again, having a balance not only makes it more interesting, but it ensures that all of our audience get the most out of that session. The purpose, therefore, of accelerated learning is to arouse curiosity, it's to get people interested so that they're getting involved quickly, they're recognising the benefits of the information that they're getting, and they're able to then ask questions, challenge the material that they're getting, and it breaks down the barriers that might be there to learning that one sole method of teaching might present. Anecdotes is a great way to generate some interest. Simple stories tend to be quite memorable, and the other things that people take away from it, particularly if there's maybe something amusing associated with them, people retain them, and then it's maybe not directly linked to the concept that you're trying to get across. But in a few months' time, they come across a similar situation, that anecdote is likely to stick in their head a lot more than a slide that just had some fairly dry technical points in it. So anecdotes, body language, humour, all of these things are quite easy to build into training sessions and help get messages across. These points here are all ways that we can ensure that our training courses are more effective, and trying to get a balance of them within a session is critical. Can't emphasise enough that you shouldn't be trying to force these things in where they don't fit. It has to be appropriate for the material, but doing what you can to have an engaging and varied learning experience, regardless of the length of the course really, is going to be critical in getting the best out of it for everyone involved. It's also more fun to do for the actual trainers as well, rather than just standing and talking to a blank-faced room for a number of hours. We mentioned there game-based learning. Game-based learning is a fairly straightforward principle, which is taking some of the concepts that we've talked about on previous slides of actually getting people physically doing things and engaging with material and concepts and effectively convey a really simple, clear message that people will retain a lot easier because there was maybe some kind of fun element or fun concept that they've done during that game-based learning session. And they tend to be interesting things you can drop in to an existing training package, or you could drop into maybe a team meeting or something like that, where you can quite quickly get across a message in a way that's going to be retained by people. Confucius, who clearly is the authority on many, many subjects, said, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. And it's that concept that game-based learning tries to encompass. Dale's cone of experience on that slide there effectively says the same thing as Confucius, but with a bit of statistics behind it about the amount of retention that's involved from people purely reading things or viewing images more passively through to at the bottom actually doing the task, whether that's having a real life emergency drill or whether it's about people getting the opportunity to do live analyses, facilitate a workshop through experience, that kind of stuff. And we've got there that 90% of what they do is going to be retained. And that's the ultimate aim of these game-based learning sessions. And there are a number of ways you can do that for safety-critical elements. So management of change, roles and responsibilities, have you got the right people with the right skills and competencies in safety-critical roles? And it's great for illustrating concepts like defence in depth, particularly when you maybe want to get that message out to a range of different employees from, as I say, your kind of workforce at the coalface through to senior management levels in a way that doesn't come with any prerequisite training or experience requirements, because it's at a nice neutral level. It's about getting engaged, having a bit of fun, maybe a bit of competition between teams, but getting over that key message of, look, this is how you interact with the plant, and this is how your responsibilities might cascade into major accident awareness. They tend to be set at being about less than an hour and have an extremely simple concept linked to a fun game. And it's all about just embedding that link so that later on, when people are conducting an activity, they think, hang on a second, this is kind of like that game we played, and they're then more likely to stop, think about what they're doing, rather than just ploughing ahead. When it comes to maximising the benefits of the training you do get, that's really something that the organisation as a whole has to ensure it properly implements and embeds throughout the organisation. So the first point we've talked before is selecting the right training. What's it about? Are the delivery methods appropriate? Is there an assessment involved? Is it set at an appropriate level for the people we want to send on it? And is it being done at a timely manner? Are people going to get to put this into practice soon? We then need to make sure that the learning outcomes are put into practice and become habits for people. So that's going to vary depending on what the training's about, but you want to get them to a position where they are actually putting that training into practice quickly. So quite often that can be as simple as the delegate, the attendee, setting themselves maybe a few personal objectives, taking responsibility for that after the course and saying, right, in the next 2 months I want to take part in a hazard workshop or a risk analysis workshop, or I want to set up an emergency drill for the plant. The most value you get from them is when somebody's line manager actually helps with that process. So together, collaboratively, the delegate and the line manager come up with some sensible objectives and some activities to cascade that learning into practice. Yeah? And in that way, you've got both the individual and the organisation helping drive that improvement. And that's extremely powerful. And then again, recognising that training isn't static. You are going to need to do refresher training. Techniques evolve, lessons are to be learned. So just because somebody went on a training course about hazard identification techniques 10 years ago doesn't mean that industry is in the same place today. There might be different practices, there might even be different tools and techniques available to help, particularly with software developments. So it's worthwhile ensuring that that training is refreshed appropriately. So can't emphasise enough that selecting the right training at the right time for the right people, using a good split of delivery methods, and then ensuring that you put that training into practice. Those are the key factors in ensuring that we can maximise the effects of our training. So hopefully we've given you some food for thought there on how to get the most from your training, and whether that's something that you're developing your own training internally, or you're thinking about sending your employees on training, or you're maybe looking at identifying some training for yourself and trying to get the most out of the experience personally. There's some food for thought there. So we've gone through those causes. We've looked at how effective training can help prevent or reduce them. We've seen how game-based learning can be used to get across some of those simple concepts in a range of environments. And hopefully giving you some understanding of the fundamental aspects of effective training and how to successfully embed training in your organisation. Okay, and on that note, I will hand back over to Liz.
Andy, thank you so much. Thank you so much for such an insightful presentation. Always insightful, but in some ways I'm still reeling from the beginning slides. It's truly shocking to hear of those incidents again, those major incidents that could have been avoided. And whilst I don't doubt many organisations have made a huge amount of progress, it just underpins that even today there is no room for complacency. Andy, I do have a couple of questions, if I may, in the time that we have available. I totally agree with you about the importance of accelerated training methods, interactive training methods, getting people to do things. And the slide that you had just shown in terms of how to embed training into the organisation. Apart from the hugely significant part that training does play, do you have a view as to what else can people do to make their organisations a proactive culture rather than a reactive?
Yeah, I think that's a significant issue, and I think one of the things that can only be cascaded down from the top. But in terms of individual responsibilities, the one thing that we can all do relatively easily is keep ourselves appraised of what's happening in the wider industry. Not just within our own industry, but sometimes across others as well, because quite often there's really valuable lessons and initiatives being acted upon in other industries that we can learn from and we can take from. And even if all we're doing is flagging it up to our immediate bosses, or if we're conveying those messages down to the people that work for us, we can be saying, look, this is a way we can improve things. And the other thing that I think is very easy to do, it's a hard thing for an organisation to foster, but a very constructive environment is one where you can challenge anything. So whether you're an operator that sees a procedure that looks like it's not particularly good, you should be able to challenge that and say, look, there's a step in here that doesn't seem to make sense. Why is that step there? And then hopefully somebody can look at that and say, right, well, that's there because it's managing the hazard on this other bit of plant, or that's there because it's doing this, or actually there's no reason why that step's in there. Let's remove it, make the process more efficient. So being able to challenge why we do things the way we've done them in the past, being able to challenge why certain training's been undertaken, why certain operations are being undertaken, why certain activities are conducted in a certain way. All of that stuff, if it's fostered properly and people see that it's being acted upon, can make your organisation a lot more proactive, because it helps minimise the potential for there to be erroneous work practices or mixed messages when it comes to production versus safety and things like that. So fostering that attitude of questioning and challenging is a really important one.
Absolutely. It is really important. I mean, after all, it's your life. If you don't question and challenge and the worst happens and there's a serious accident, it's your life at stake. So question, challenge, have that mindset that says you are going to be responsible along with everybody else in your organisation for making it a safe working place. And do you have any words of encouragement here, Andy? In all of the years that you've been involved in this, do you think that people are getting better at challenging and questioning and regarding themselves as responsible rather than somebody else?
Yeah, I think they are. I think we could be pessimistic about it, but I think the reality of the situation is that organisations are realising that they have to be more proactive. They are getting on board with this kind of concept of chronic unease a little bit more, that there are going to be things in their organisation that aren't great. There are going to be errors and failures and mistakes made, but approaching them in a sensible, constructive way, getting the engagement of the workforce behind them is going to help. I think that's reflected as well in the types of incident we're having. Don't want to tempt fate, but we are seeing an improvement in safety cultures as a whole. There's still quite a way to go in some organisations and in some industries, but I think people are more open to questioning, they're more open to trying to learn, and the regulator as well, I think, helps in being more constructive and more supportive where appropriate, to get people to think a bit wider and not be insulated within their own organisation or their own industry. And technology as well helps with that. Webinars like these, distance learning programmes, industry forums, all those kinds of things help to try and improve that and share lessons and so on.
And if we have anybody listening, Andy, who belongs to an organisation that is not as proactive as we think it should be,
I think in words of encouragement for anyone who is in an organisation where they aren't learning so well, or they aren't being supportive, I think you just have to keep plugging away. Don't stop challenging things that might be awkward, but as Liz said before, what you don't want to do is not do it and then something potentially happens.
Andy, thank you so much for responding to those questions there. I know that people will have lots of questions front of their mind, and we've had time to just share a few of them, but they were very important questions and answered in a lot of detail. Thank you for that. It remains for me now, in the time that we have, just to signpost people to the related training programs that we have in 2018. You remember from Andy's slide that he talked about risk reduction and ALARP. Well, as you can see, in May 18 we have a training program on that and one on Bowtie risk management. April 18 we have hazard identification and risk analysis. Remembering what Andy said, the right people on the right programs at the right time. and you will find that those programs reflect everything that Andy has said in terms of interactivity and appealing to various learning styles. Of course, you would expect that. So please feel free to email us at training@imeki.org or telephone us, the numbers on the slide there, and register for those, because places will go quickly. I know they will. They're such important programs, so do contact us. In addition to the training programs, we are of course continuing our series of webinars. You'll recall I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar session that this was one of the series. Well, you can see we're starting again in January after the festive break, where we'll be talking about presenting and public speaking. And then we have a full agenda right through to November with everyday engineering ethics. So again, go online, register for those, see what they're about, and put them into your diary now, so that you know that they're into your schedule. And of course, at the bottom of the slide there is a link that you can use to actually meet the trainers who are going to be presenting those webinars, so you can get to know a bit more about their subject matter expertise, as you've heard Andy's expertise today. Okay, that's all I have to say. I just want to say a very big thank you to listening to us today and joining us. I hope you got a lot out of it. I have no doubt that you will have done. But of course, I'm going to reserve my final thank you to Andy for sharing your time and, even more importantly, sharing your expertise in this matter. So Andy, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure. It's been great. Okay, everyone, feel free to log out whenever you're ready. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you at our next webinar in January. Thanks, and bye-bye for now.